concerns and empower grassroots labor rights movements in ASEAN member states. We would like to have this webinar as a consultation platform to gather input and engage various stakeholders, including workers, employers, civil society organizations, and governments in the ASEAN. So today we will be looking at we will try to respond to particular questions. These questions are, what are the major challenges faced by workers in the ASEAN as regards to their right to freedom of association? And how has COVID-19 exacerbated these challenges and affected workers' rights to freedom of association? What needs to change in the existing policy environment so that freedom of association is protected and advanced? And how can workers and organizations use a regional guidance to advance the right to freedom of association? We're very lucky to have excellent and knowledgeable speakers today. We have a speaker from the Unity of Women for Freedom Philippines, or KAISAKA. We have a speaker also from the Confederation of Congress of Indonesian Unions Alliance, or CASB. We also have with us a prominent lawyer from Malaysia and a senior legal advisor from the International Commission of Jurists, who leads our organization's work on business and human rights. We are also very, very lucky to have with us the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. So for this session, we'd like this to be very interactive, and we'd like participants to provide their input on the Regional Freedom of Association Guidance Initiative and exchange ideas on advocacy strategies for the guidance. Each speaker will be given 10 minutes to present their views, and then a Q&A will follow, and the Special Rapporteur will also be giving his comments and reaction. Okay, sorry. So I think somebody needs to give the logistics for this session. So Dory, will you be doing it?
Yes, I will. Thank you. Thank you, Emerlyn. Hi, and welcome to the side event of the United Nations Forum on Responsible Business and Human Rights. As Emerlyn already mentioned, this is the session on freedom of association of workers in ASEAN, initiative to create a new regional guidance. I'm Dory from Insight Pack, supporting this webinar to make sure everything on the technical side runs smoothly. You may have noticed that the chat has been disabled for this webinar, but please feel free to submit any comments or questions to the Q&A window, which you can find by clicking the button that says Q&A on the bottom of your screen. The moderator will be looking at the questions submitted there, and after the panelists speak, there will be a Q&A session, as Emerlyn mentioned, and the questions may be addressed time permitting. And with that, I will now hand back over to Emerlyn Hill, who's the Senior Legal Advisor of the International Commission of Jurists. Emerlyn?
Thank you very much, Dory. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker today is a lawyer from the Unity of Women for Freedom Philippines, or KAISAKA, Ms. Virginia Suarez. Attorney Suarez, you have the floor.
Yeah. The first slide, please. Yeah. The right to freedom of association is as important as the work itself, because it is only through the work or the right to form a union that the full benefits of employment can be enjoyed by women. Slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. Women is a force to reckon with. It's 51% of the 42 million workers in the Philippines are women. Yet, women are oftentimes excluded. This data is a government data. It will show that all I mean, most, if not all, women in the Philippines are employed. This is fake news. This data is not true. The truth is, 7 out of 10 women are already excluded in this data. This means that 7 out of 10 women are actually unemployed. Yeah. Unless the government data rectifies itself and unless the government shows the actual situation of the employment in the Philippines, the government will never be able to resolve the problem in the economy, especially the unemployment and problem in the Philippines. Next slide, please. There is an increasing number of informal workers. I mean, Duterte himself said, I will give you jobs, but I hate unions. And when it comes to informal workers, I mean, there is no job security, very low wage, and no social benefits. And of course, there are always this sexual harassment and discrimination. Philippines is known as the capital of malls. There are so many malls here in the Philippines. There are so many fast food chains, so many tourist spots. And in all this, women are employed, and women are employed as agency workers, as contractual employees, as seasonal employees, as per project employees, or fixed period employment are given to women. SM alone, for example, boasts of 62,000 employees. These are all agency workers. 70% are women. And these agency workers, they are regular to the agency, but not to SM, never to the principal employee. Stalls in malls, stores in trains, in bus terminals, all these employ women, and they are being paid only for 250 pesos to 300 pesos, and that's just about $5 to $6 per day, which is or 50% only of the minimum wage here in the Philippines. And of course, I mean, how can we expect regular employment from this administration when the government itself is the biggest contractor? All contractual governments, out of 4 out of 10 are women. We have our teachers in government schools are contractuals, are called job orders. Our teachers in private contractuals or agency workers, and the same holds true with our nurses. Golf courses. There are so many golf courses here in the Philippines, and caddies are women. Golf courses, they always advertise young women. They only hire women as caddies, but they are not considered employees of caddies. They are considered as independent workers. They are expected to be at the job site at the golf course and wait for 8 hours, wait for their queue to be called. But if their numbers are not called, then they will never be paid. So it's like a basis. And in all this kind of informal work, in golf courses, in malls, in stores, in all this kind of informal work, women always suffer the sexual harassment and discrimination, always this verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And this become even more prevalent under Duterte because Duterte himself is a misogynist. Duterte does not mince word when it comes to disrespecting women. What do you expect from the employers? So sexual harassment and discrimination against women become very prevalent under this administration. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. And we talk about women's benefits, no? the women benefits simply become paper victories. We have the family planning requires employers to have some for family planning services. This is I mean, I do not know of a company that that has a clinic for family planning services. It is zero implementation under this administration. Yes. Next slide. Yeah. Breastfeeding area in workplace. I mean, very few companies have a breastfeeding area in a workplace. Vow leave, very limited to formally employed unionized. There is no vow leave when it comes to informal workers or informal, yes, to women in informal work. And of course, the flexible employment affects the right to form the union. There is always this climate of violence and against trade union against trade unionists, against workers, against women leaders who are exercising the right to freedom of association. Next slide, please. So the situation of the women, even before the pandemic, is very much is very difficult. Security, again, no social benefits. There is this, and patriarchy is at work in almost all enterprises. That's very prevalent. The sexual harassment and discrimination is very much prevalent. This has even worsened during the pandemic when women suffer without pandemic, but during pandemic, when there is pandemic, and when there is crisis, all the more that in fact, how does the government, how does problem of the women only by giving financial support? However, the financial support is only given on a per family. It's not all solo parents being not. It's not all women workers are being given financial support. It's on a per family. So one-time financial support of 5,000 to 8,000 to a family of 5 to 10 definitely is not enough for a 3 month, because we've been under quarantine for 3 months now. And of course, the support, the food support is given on a monthly basis. Bag of grocery per family on a monthly basis is not enough, of course. Next slide, please. And during this pandemic, there are so much human rights violations. There is no mass testing, limited food support, limited financial assistance, and all the more, instead of this Duterte bailing out the masses from this pandemic, the state is now, this Duterte administration is now terrorizing the workers and activists, but through this anti-terror bill. We cannot imagine this administration certifying this anti-terror bill as an urgent bill while people suffer from so much poverty, suffer from so much for lack of work, and suffer from for lack of mass testing. This anti-terror bill now terrorizes the Philippines while we are in pandemic. And this is actually targeting all those critical government, all those complaining, especially those complaining and complaining how the government addresses the problem in COVID-19. Well, as you can see in the slide, these are the main problems anti-terrorism bill.
Attorney Suarez, I can give you one more minute probably to wrap
Oh,
up.
okay. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Marilyn. Um, we are now under GCQ. We are now under GCQ. Yet under GCQ, only 50% of work are allowed by in different companies. But in reality, it's not really 15%. It's not really 50%. It's actually 15 to 25%. With social distancing, certainly the companies will not be able to allow all its workers to work. And the problem is this government does not have any solution. So now what are facing now? Job, second, protection, safe work, and of course, safety. Still, the mass testing, still the protection from this COVID-19. These are the problem now: safety and protection, transportation, and work. We cannot. We can. I mean, women cannot work without transportation. In the end, I'd like to say that right now we are commemorating our Independence Day on 12. So we commemorate it with resistance. So thank you so much, Emerlyn.
Thank you, Attorney Suarez. Thank you for highlighting the increasing number of informal workers and the fact that a significant percentage of informal workers in the Philippines are women. And a key challenge they face right now, well, it is the patriarchal and misogynistic atmosphere in the country that's aggravated by the current administration. These informal women workers are unable to organize themselves as well and unable to access specific services that would allow them to survive this pandemic, so them and their families to survive this pandemic. And thank you also for pointing out that safety and protection is actually a key challenge that many women informal workers face right now, especially in the context of the pandemic. And also transportation, since movement is still limited in most parts of the Philippines. And many women workers are having a hard time accessing or getting onto transportation to get to their workplaces. Our next speaker is from Indonesia. We'd like to see what's happening in Indonesia and what is the situation there. And also the challenges that trade union workers now face in the context of this pandemic as they pursue their right to freedom of association. I'd like to introduce today Mr. Simon from the Confederation of Congress of Indonesian Unions Alliance, or CASPI. Mr. Simon, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon or good morning for everyone. First of all, I like to say this: the freedom of association must be parallel with the freedom of expression, or freedom to express, to freedom to expression, because otherwise you can only have a formality of the to join or to establish the union, because it's happened now in Indonesia. Because like Indonesia, we already ratified all the fundamental convention of ILO, like 87, 98, and 144. It's already implemented in the national law, but the problem we are facing for maybe 2 or 3 years now is the limitation created by the government and by the law for the union or the people to express their concern or their opinion, because we have a lot of cases like in Indonesia. when the union or the activists try to express their opinion, they usually got a problem with the law because we have like a internet and transaction electronic law, which is usually used by the government and or the employer uh, to criminalize the union. And the freedom of association actually also depend on the positioning of the government regarding to the political economy perspective. Like in Indonesia, uh, during the Jokowi administration, the the most concentration of the government is to like in favor for the investor. So uh, then the government like issued the government regulation number 75 years 2015 regarding to the minimum wage, which is actually violate the ILO convention number 144, because now the government uh, could uh, could put the minimum wage by by his own, not regarding to the bargaining of the or the uh, tripartite mechanism. So it's happened in Indonesia because maybe in the Asian region, Indonesia is the, maybe you can say, the one country with like all already ratified all the fundamentals ILO convention. But it's for us it's just a formality because there's no there's a lack of the government willingness to enforce or imply this freedom. And it's like for now during the pandemic in Indonesia we have like a multi-layer crisis, like from for the health crisis because of the COVID-19 and the economic crisis, and also the shrinking of democratic space. That's the big problem for us now. And for your information, the freedom of association in Indonesia actually is very big threat because during the pandemic, there's a big number of the mass dismissal for the workers. In my record is already for the early of this month is already 3 million workers dismissed, and it's of course impact the freedom of association because now the government will imply the working models to recruit all the casual workers and etc., which is actually implied the strategy to flexibility workers. So it's the big challenge for us. And like for migrant workers, which is Indonesia actually have like million workers, migrant workers works outside Indonesia. The biggest problem is for in context of freedom of association, I think how the workers in destination country like in Malaysia, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and other countries like in Middle East can join or establish the union, because in my opinion, unless they can join the union, the right of these migrant workers is always under the threat, because uh, we have like a lot of number of the case which is migrant workers is like abused or even killed during their work abroad. So the uh, access to join the union, I think, is very important for us. Of course, this is the uh, very hot debate actually, also in our discussion groups in the ICJ and BHSRC, which is also it's related to the like national sovereignty and etc. But we must look and think very hard to solve this problem, because unless the migrant workers can join or have access to the union, their basic rights actually under big threat. I think I will finish my presentation here, and maybe I can have a question and answer session next. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Your presentation, although short, actually says a lot about the situation in Indonesia and also hits the nail on the situation that many workers are facing now during this pandemic. You correctly pointed out that in Indonesia and also in many other places, there is this multi-layered crisis. Because of the pandemic, you pointed out that 3 million workers have been dismissed. And moving forward, after the quarantines and lockdowns, the government would likely allow recruitment of casual workers or those workers who are not unionized or who would later on say that they do not belong to unions. And you also pointed out that freedom of association in Indonesia largely depends on how the government of the day perceives the health of the economy. So right now, all over the world, the economy is actually not in a good state. And there would likely be more challenges faced by workers who aim to exercise their freedom of association. And you also raised the issue, which I hope our next speaker will touch upon, coming from one of the receiving countries in the ASEAN. You also, Simon, you also raised the issue of Indonesian migrant workers in Southeast Asian countries. So on that note, I'd like to give the floor to our next speaker, who is a prominent lawyer from Malaysia, Mr. Edmund Bond from Amar Bond and Associates.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me, and thank you Em for giving me the floor. I am using this probably for the first time presenting something, so I'm getting a bit used to it. I have 3 key questions that I've been asked to answer, and I'll just frame it in these terms. Why do we need proposed guidelines for the freedom of association in the region? 2, what needs to be done by employers and unions post-COVID? In other words, immediately. And what do sustainability indexes need to demand post-COVID in terms of how we link the right to freedom of association with how businesses view some of these indicators when they try and do their self-reporting. So the right to freedom of association is absent from the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, but every person has the right to work and to enjoy just, decent and favorable conditions of work. So the declaration provides that every person has the right to form trade unions of his or her choice to protect his or her interests according to national laws. So the problem becomes that the practices among the countries are different because not all countries have ratified the ILO Convention of '87 on freedom of association and protection of the right to organize. And national laws then provide for different standards which may not be consistent with global standards. So therefore, regional guidance is needed to highlight some of these particularities and peculiarities with these standards. And we will be using some of these guidelines or some of the notes of these guidelines to advocate with government and businesses to advance freedom of association in the region. So in this sense, the guidelines is an attempt to regionalize Convention 87, and to get governments to sign up. But even before governments are wanting to sign up to Convention 87, to get businesses accelerated on it and to try and get them implemented in workplaces. Secondly, COVID-19 has wreaked havoc around the world. People have suffered, lives have been upended, and economies disrupted. We have new challenges emerging while existing ones are getting worse. And the knock-on effect of some of these lockdowns, I think we have seen, have resulted in unavoidable consequences for many workers. So workers are struggling with food and shelter and other immediate needs, and the vulnerable now face multiple threats. So in this sense, what I would recommend in terms of what civil society should do and what we should be advocating immediately would be, one, there should be real discussions, there should be genuine negotiations now between workers and employers where there are change in their terms and working conditions. We have seen in Malaysia how some salaries have been cut from 20% to 80% and some up to 100%. In normal situations, this would be constructive dismissal, but employers would be telling employees, because of the situation, please accept this, and then in this name of agreement, because employees stand in a weaker position, abuse happens. So there should be that kind of discussion that happens, and I don't see that happening. It's a lot of unilateral decisions being made to cut salaries and to reduce even protective measures for workers in the name of cost efficiency. But this, secondly, would entail increased amount of good, sufficient, and accurate information. So a lot of what is happening with the employers happen because, or the abuse happens because employers do not give sufficient information on what's really happening to justify these changes. Thirdly, there should be more proactive procedures for the setting up of unions and groups within organizations. It is not enough, I think we see quite often, it is not enough for employers to say, yeah, we do not discourage or prohibit them from setting up a union, but there is no procedure or no rules or no practical guidance how it's to be set up. So this needs to change, and the employers should positively now encourage and assist even the setting up of unions by way of, for example, providing startup funds. Fourth, I think I'm on my fourth point, we should need to look at implementing a living wage, no longer minimum wage. We should stop talking about minimum wage. We should start talking about a living wage. And how do we calculate the living wage in the region would vary from country to country, but that discussion has to start in terms of what CSOs and human rights groups should be looking at and researching. Non-retaliation policies should also be in place by way of effective grievance mechanisms, not just in way of written commitments, but we should make sure that reprisals in practice do not happen by way when there are safeguards and where people can complain anonymously, but where effective action is taken. And of course, this was mentioned, I think, by many speakers already throughout this forum. Contract workers, those in the informal sector, short-term workers, persons working from home, outsourced workers, these new models of employment should be looked into, and these workers should be protected. They should also be recognized, and we need to reimagine what we talk about, or what we mean by trade unions or collectives for these type of workers to bargain their lot. So arrangements for this type of contract workers should be reviewed, and there should be new discussions as to how they should be protected by way of organization. Finally, I'm looking at sustainability indexes. So a lot of companies do self-reporting, and they try and get onto indexes that they, will promote their business, Dow Jones, and so many different types of indexes that I've lost track of. But these drivers are important, but it's not a way to just justify certain types of practices in companies. It should be a driver to encourage better human rights practices. And there are two in terms of freedom of association that I would like to highlight. One, the recommendation should be, we should start calling out for more independent audit assessments of these reports. These reports are all self-reporting. A lot of organizations like to bandy, glossy reports around, and a lot of the UN organizations also like to say, yeah, this is a good report, this is self-reporting. But I think we need to have independent audit assessments of these reports. Verification should be done by CSOs or NGOs or independent experts to look not really at what is only said, but look at whether there is real impact of these assessments on the ground. Secondly, a higher prioritization or weight or score should be given in terms of FOA, freedom of association, to indicators such as the number of workers unionized, how often negotiations conducted with unions, how much of the terms have been covered by collective agreements, what percentage of the coverage of terms have been implemented are part of collective agreement negotiations, how many complaints and actions taken on union busting measures, whether direct or indirect, and reprisals have been dealt with properly. And again, the quality and quantity of information given to employees. How much and what quality of information is given to employees in terms of the flow of information and business operations. That kind of flow of information must be more meaningful. I will stop there, Em. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Edmund. And we really appreciate the very, very good points that you have raised. And also for pointing out that this initiative of putting together the guidelines is to regionalize the relevant ILO conventions. Also, and I think this has been, if you remember, the discussion of the new models of employment, such as work from home employees or short-term workers. This has already been raised during one of the working group meetings that we've had. And there was really a vigorous discussion there because this entails re-envisioning what is a trade union. And we had trade union groups, we had trade unions in the room at that time. And I think we need to push forward this discussion because we need to think about, especially in this time, how do you organize these new workers, these workers of these new models of employment? How do we exercise our freedom of association? How do we unionize? So those are the questions I think that we should be discussing, not only in this particular session, but maybe moving forward as we develop the guidelines. I think definitely it would be a shame if this will not be reflected in the new guidelines, considering that the guidelines have been developed within the pandemic or during the pandemic. With that, I'd like to move forward by introducing to you a colleague of ours who has been essential and pivotal in contributing to this work and to these discussions. I'd like to introduce to you the lead of the International Commission of Jurists on the area of business and human rights, Mr. Carlos Lopez. Hola, Carlos, you have the floor.
Good morning in my time here for everyone. Good afternoon for you, I understand. It is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks in the first place to the organizers, of course, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and to the International Commission of Jurists, the Asia program, and other colleagues who have taken this wonderful initiative to convene us for this discussion. We have a very good panel, a good 5 stars lineup. So congratulations again also to the organizations that have sponsored the whole forum. What is my task in the few minutes I have for me is to elaborate further on some of the content that could go into these guidelines. I think Edmund has already spoken very eloquently about why we need guidance of this sort for the region. I think it is a question of regionalizing, and provide additional elements for implementation of international standards that are already there, but need to be adapted to the specific circumstances, concerns, and needs in the region. and to the particular also forms of organization of and challenges that unions and workers and others are facing. So I will start then with the possible content. I think we have to put emphasis on implementation always, and also in concrete practical ways in which freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly, and as part of freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining, including the right to strike, could be implemented and respected in the region. And let me, well, there is a lot of content already that's been said, so it's very wonderful to hear Virginia Suarez, Simon, and Edmond as well, that there have been very specific input from regional or local situations. And also, I think we have already a draft that has a very good content. I don't need to repeat all that, but from rescuing from what has been said now, or other speakers have said, but I also have in my list, I will raise a couple of points, or emphasize a couple of points. First, the question of implementation, respect and implementation of freedom of association in times of emergencies, such as this one. I mean, emergency situation originated by a pandemic that threatens the right to health and life of the whole population in the region and in the world. So what are the parameters to be respected? There is a lot already in international law in this regard. We need to remind all of those parameters that when there is a need to pass certain measures, legislative of other kind, those limitations that may be adopted to the right to freedom of association have to be necessary and proportional to meet the threat and the challenges of the day. So this is not, I mean, many governments we have seen in these days have taken measures that are very far-reaching, many times going beyond what is needed with a view of impinging on the freedoms and rights of people. I think that we need to remind also governments, states, and other actors that there are specific parameters under international law that need to be respected. It is important that we call on authorities to issue guidance, specific guidance in accordance to international law on the exercise of freedom of association and collective bargaining in these particular circumstances when emergencies arise. In relation to public demonstrations, for instance, in relation to assembly of the associations, in relation to the freedom of expression of these organizations during this time. There is lots of uncertainty there, and this is used many times by those who really try to seek to restrict or limit the right of freedom of association. In the second place, I will also raise or point to the question of protection of workers, the leaders, unions, and organizations that work with them, promoting the rights and supporting their rights in litigation and in advocacy. There has been many instances, and also in times of emergency, but in normal times, of harassment, threats, intimidation, attacks that have a chilling effect, but also clearly discourage and very clearly also many times they stop and deter people, workers, from exercising their rights and defending the rights in court. So the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, ICJ, and many organizations have already also issued a number of reports on how these strategic lawsuits are used to intimidate many of the lawyers or organizations that are litigating in the defense of the rights of unions and workers. So this is a clear message to be sent out there that there should not be any use of these mechanisms to intimidate those who are the rights holders. I would also talk about the freedom of association in relation to internet and communication technologies. So that's another key element that I think needs attention. The current events in relation to the pandemic and the emergency have shown us how important technology, communication technologies are these days for us to exercise our rights, not only those related to freedom of expression, as Simone has said, no? But also in relation to the right to meet, the right to assembly, the right to exchange views and coordinate events, actions, etc., including public demonstrations if need be in this circumstance. So I think it's important that we incorporate something there in the guidance that builds on international standards, but try to land on a specific concerns and challenges met in the region. In particular, I think it is very important that we address the role and the need for social media platforms such as Facebook and WhatsApp and others to adopt certain parameters in their content moderation and also in the protection of speech. Many times content or freedom of speech could be also be threatened by these technological companies. There is a link, evident link here in relation to freedom of expression and opinion and the right to seek information. The question of fake news, disinformation, and all the kinds of disturbances of the right to freedom of expression has also to be quelled. Let me move now in the 2 or 3 minutes that remaining for me to how workers and others can use this guidance in a way that is effective and clear for the protection of rights. In the first place, I think it is not only workers that need to use this, or whose benefit we are producing this guidance. I think anybody, I mean, lawyers, advisors, promoters of freedom of association, the leaders of the associations themselves, all the kinds of organizations. And also, I think, as others, Edmund concretely has said, business organizations, business enterprises could also benefit from some guidance in relation to freedom of association. I think many of them are sometimes oblivious about international standards. So we need to remind them of the benefits they will actually draw from the use or from the full respect of international standards of freedom of association. In concrete, this guidance should be very useful if they are going to concrete and focus on implementation for advocacy. And I think advocacy is one of the activities that need to be, listed absolutely in our plan of work for the adoption of measures, legislation, promoting legal change at the national level, all right, including in the policies that regional or international organizations may adopt. I think it's important that litigation, this instrument, of course, having guidance is of course not a legally binding instrument. No, this is no legally binding, but it's built on international legally binding standards and could be a useful support for the arguments we use in litigation. Especially because if we consider that there are similar guidance at the international level and at the regional level in Africa and in Europe. So, and now I think also there is something in Latin America. Training is another important element in our strategy. I think training has to be, and research and documentation. This is a set of guidelines, of course, as a program of action. We should see it in that way. Beyond a set of standards, that's something that reaffirms existing standards and adapts them, regionalize them. Also, establish a program of action for the next few years. What we should be doing, where should we emphasize, and what should be the focus of our action. So with that, I stop. I thank you, Emily.
Okay, thank you so much, Carlos. Yes, definitely. Thank you also for raising the how we can move forward with these guidelines, looking specifically on implementation, and also mentioning the strategic lawsuits that are being used right now by many companies to intimidate the workers from exercising their right to freedom of association. And you also pointed out that guidelines like this, which we are drafting right now, would be useful when states want to adopt legislation on the same topic, and also for policy making purposes. It's quite nicely also as a segue that you mentioned that similar guidelines do exist in other regions. And we are very, very lucky to have the support and also the expertise and the time being shared to us by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly. And he himself has been involved in the development of similar guidelines in Africa. In fact, this was the reason why I started the conversation with him perhaps years ago. And I'd like to invite Mr. Clement Voog right now to take the floor and speak more on his views and reactions of the presentations and the discussions brought on by the other panelists. So, Clement, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Emeline. I would like to thank the International Commission of Jurists and the Business and Human Rights Center for organizing this webinar and for also inviting me. I want also to thank my fellow panelists for the very important and insight presentation, which also gave the broad perspective on the current situation in their respective country, and also Carlos for really raising some of the important aspects that the guideline need to address, but also how it's important to keep in mind that the effectiveness of any guidelines is about how it's able also to be implemented, how you can provide the implementation to how you can be more effective and link it with the reality and the context. And I think the work that you are doing there is really important, and I want to congratulate you. I'm very happy to see that this initiative of the guideline, which were launched in my presence last year in Bangkok, have developed and evolved into the current drafts, which I have quick look, and I think it's really interesting. It has been a long process, but this webinar and the current draft encourage me that we are on the right path. I want to congratulate all of you and especially the organizer for all the work done. The rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and of association enable people to communicate, mobilize, organize, and connect, favoring solidarity and partnership and contributing to shaping public opinion and decision-making, thus constituting a real driver of change. These rights are essential, as you mentioned, for workers. They lay the bedrock that allow them to organize and to speak collectively. We have already heard about this during your exchange and during also what Simon you also raised in your presentation. But I would like to highlight just a couple of points. These rights make it possible for workers to form union. The right to association gives every worker the possibility to join with peer and to defend their interests against an often overly powerful employer. By joining forces, they can show that they speak with one voice and have a common cause and purpose. This also strengthens in numbers always allow union to engage in collective bargaining. which can ensure appropriate pay, healthcare, coverage, and fair pensions. It is the backbone of the collective power of workers. However, the right to freedom of assembly might be always as important for workers as it is the rights which allow them to get together and draw the public attention to their causes, no matter if this is for fairer wage, a safe workplace, or for environmental or social causes. The right to freedom of assembly and association can also, through the tools explained before, be a massive driver for the elimination of poverty. In the end, it is the people working on the field, in factories, services, or other labor markets that can lift themselves out of poverty if they are given a fair wage and when their rights are protected. These rights are also very essential to the 2030 agenda, as I have highlighted in my report to the UN General Assembly last year. In implementing the 2030 agenda, I strongly believe that an important component for creating an enabling environment in recognizing the intrinsic value of civil society and of the workers. It is essential to create meaningful and institutional space where the diverse and pluralist voices can be heard and valued in contributing to the achievement of all the goals, especially SDG 2 on zero hunger and SDG 16 on peace and security. State positive obligation to protect and facilitate the exercise of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association of workers include ensuring that businesses' activity do not violate these rights. The duty to protect is well developed by the international human rights law framework. They involve, among others, obligation to adopt and enforce enabling law and regulation, create independent and effective enforcement oversight and adjudicatory mechanism, and ensure effective remedies for violation of rights. I'm happy to see these obligations are being developed in detail in the current drafts. I would now like to say just a few words about the responsibility of the business to respect and protect human rights. Business enterprises must adhere to the principle to do no harm by avoiding causing or contributing to violation of peaceful assembly and associations rights. Accordingly, companies should adopt in their policy commitments respect for civic freedoms and recognition of the importance of labor's organizing in democratic and sustainable development. But business need to move beyond commitments. Business enterprises must exercise human rights due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for violation to workers' rights to freedom of expression, assembly, and association. To be effective, due diligence process should include assessing actual and potential human rights impacts, integrating findings from impact assessment across relevant company, processes, and activity, and taking appropriate action to address them, tracking the effectiveness of the responses, and communicating on how impacts are being addressed. This means ensuring these rights are also protected and respected by their partners, suppliers, or subcontractors. This is especially crucial in those in countries without an adequate institutional and legal framework for recognizing trade union and for collective bargaining. In those environments, too, it is important that companies seek out external assessments, as Simon, you mentioned it, evaluating, monitoring, purchasing practices, and their compliance with human rights. The guidelines presented will help with all the points mentioned above. They will become a handy tool for workers to defend and claim their rights. Furthermore, they will serve as guidance for businesses to ensure that they are doing their part in due diligence and do no harm. The guideline will hopefully also help ASEAN member states to enforce their right to peaceful assembly and association in the workplace and beyond. With your help and determination, we will be able to create guidelines that will bring these three critical forces, the workers, the businesses, and state together to protect the human rights of millions of workers. I want also to reiterate here that the current COVID environment creates another dimension that were not there when we met in Bangkok. It is important that this guideline also address the problem of the current ways that the work was reformed, and also to ensure that how do we continue to protect the workers' rights in such crisis time like COVID-19. In my 10 principle that I'm sure you have, on the 6th principle, I also mentioned the importance to ensure the protection of workers in the workplace, because the COVID-19 showed us that we need to value all the workers and that we need to ensure that whenever we are in this time of crisis, workers like doctors can still enjoy their freedom of expression and can also still enjoy their freedom of organize themselves to be able to denounce whatever information the state is keeping or whatever action state is doing in order to curtail the fundamental freedoms. So I would like to end there, and I will be available also for any question, for anything that you would like also to discuss with me. But I want again to congratulate you that what you are doing there is a great work, and then we hope that the work that you are doing there will also impact other regions, and by giving them other tools to be able. And also, I want also to reassure you that this guideline will be also part of the work that I will be doing with ASEAN countries, pushing the states to implement them, but also to own those guidelines and to amend their national legislation. Thank you very much, Emmeline, and I'm looking forward for our exchange.
Thank you very much, Clement, and thank you really for those really great points, which basically put together and very comprehensively what was raised earlier by the panelists. We now go into our question and answer part of our webinar, and we already have a number of questions here, which I will read out to the panelists and to Clement. I have grouped the questions for now into 3 sections. First, there's a couple of questions on freedom of association and COVID, which Clement actually very impressively said that these guidelines, we should look at it again and see how it would address this problem, this new context of COVID-19, because it actually emphasizes a lot of other ways people are working right now, and how do you protect the freedom of association of these types of workers. The second group of questions are on with regards to the development of the guidelines, engagement of other sectors. And the third set of questions is with regards to migrant workers in the ASEAN. So I'll read out, this is more of a comment actually, which flows nicely into what Simon actually said regarding the situation in Indonesia, where millions of workers have been laid off because of the pandemic. So Veronica said that in the Philippines, 2,000 companies have declared permanent closure, redundancy, and retrenchments. You have 70,000 Filipino workers have lost their jobs as an impact of the pandemic, according to the Department of Labor and Employment. And greatly affected of this are the regular workers who also belong to unions. Those who are called to report to work, the company is selecting those workers who are not identified or affiliated to unions. Again, this is because of the aversion of companies to unions. So the workers they are inviting back to work are those who are not identified or affiliated with unions. In relation to that, we have a question from Dr. Rath. He's asking, freedom of association is a fundamental right in India. The right to collective bargaining is being incorporated in the Industrial Relations Code of 2019. In the post-globalized world, the trends on collective bargaining have not been very encouraging. In post-COVID-19 scenario, with the economic slowdown, increase in gig economy, and growing contractualization of workforce vis-a-vis weaker unions, what are the opportunities to strengthen collective bargaining framework and mechanisms? So that's for the first set of questions. I'll just go to the second set of questions on migrant workers and then give the floor to the panelists to answer, and then we'll have another round. So Andrew Koo from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia asks, within ASEAN, in terms of migrant workers, there are sending countries and receiving countries. Is it possible to have uniform standards and guidelines for workers across the board? Can one set of principles be made to apply uniformly and consistently throughout? Can the sending countries insist on rights for their nationals working in receiving countries if they do not exist or are poorly protected in sending countries themselves? What would be the positive drivers for an increase or upgrade in working standards and protections? So before we go on to the next set of questions, I open the floor to the panelists. So maybe we can, Clement, since you were the last one to speak, would you be okay to do the first response, and then we go to the other speakers?
I think I would just elaborate a little bit on the first question, and I think I will also call other panelists to feel free to kind of also come in, because the question also is more related on what is going on and what is happening currently on the ground in relation to the workers in this particular environment of COVID-19. And I think from the information that I receive, and which also on which I base my 10 principle, which the one of the principles talking about the protection of the freedom of association and assembly at workers' place, is also that while we see that during this COVID-19 there was a lockdown, there was many of companies or many of enterprises that were called essential that were still working. And workers were working under difficult circumstances. Even sometimes also, some also raised the issue about their own health, where there was a critical spread of the pandemic. They have to go to work and all of those things. And the question was that, can then in this particular circumstance where the states declared the emergency, can their rights be suspended, the right to organize and the rights also to really protest can be suspended where they are required to continue their work. And we think that is important in this particular time of crisis where the workers still essential. They are still those who are keeping the society alive, moving, feeding us, and all of these things. It's important that states ensure that this workers' place is safe. So we cannot put the workers' health in a critical situation without really ensuring that the companies take all necessary measures to put in place health conditions that allow workers to continue to work. And we also saw that from the perspective of the health personnel. We saw where some of the health personnel that were critical was also provide information that also contradict some of the figures that was given by government. Some of them were fired. And we say that there is important also to really ensure the freedom of expression, to protect the right to information, and also to ensure that those workers are not bound by these kind of rules that prevent them to be able to provide information to the public. Because in this COVID time, we know that one of the critical problem was information, was the data. Some governments didn't give proper data, and because we are all locked down, the only entity that controlled how the information was put there was governments. And it's important that those working on health sector, those who are declared like essential work, they are providing to the space. And we saw also COVID from global south to the western here, that many health personnel also died because there was not a proper measure put in place in order to help them to work in safe environments. So for us, it's really important. This is what I highlight in my 10 principles. So I will just maybe leave it there, because I know a lot of other questions are more linked to the specific presentations.
Okay, thank you, Clement. I'd like to ask the other speakers to perhaps respond to these two questions. And also just a reminder to keep your responses maybe at 1 minute, because we are trying to keep to the time. Maybe we'll go with Attorney Suarez, Edmund, Simon, and Carlos. Attorney Suarez, you're muted.
Yes. Okay. I'm related to the question as what can be done now to collective negotiation. You know, for women with patriarchy at work in almost all enterprises, women have the risk of being terminated first, no? Whether or not it's a retrenchment or to be placed in a floating status or temporary stoppage of work. Women ran the risk of being terminated first because they are seen as weak, docile, or simply yes. But my suggestion is because when we speak of collective negotiation, it means we are referring to a company that is already unionized or already has collective a CBA. So my suggestion is for the union to immediately take the initiative of having a genuine discussion with the management. For otherwise, if we leave it to the management will just either close or retrench. And yes, possibly management will choose the workers who are not close to the union. And so it is best that the union immediately take the initiative. What can be done to prevent the losses? What can be done to prevent dismissal or to prevent the possibly rotational, possibly shifting or what? At least, because if we take the initiative, if the union takes the initiative, then the management can see the reasonableness of those of the union. I mean, I think it will be positive. It will the union will have a positive image from the company, from the employers, if immediately they will be the one to take initiative. And maybe the union can actually incorporate as to how exactly a safe work is in a workplace, considering that there is a pandemic.
Thank you, Attorney Suarez. Edmund, and then Simon, and then Carlos.
Yeah, I'll just deal with Andrew's question in two ways. One, we have seen how ASEAN took almost 9 or 10 years, I can't remember now, to get the consensus agreed. And even then, the consensus is a hybrid type of document, which is not legally binding. So yes, it's going to be very challenging. But two, the answer, and I think we have not really done that kind of baseline study where the national laws or the national regulations or the national mechanisms have been really compared in terms of FOAA. And that's perhaps something that we need to do. But also what I would be interested in, and when, you know, we were during the time in ICHA when they were negotiating the consensus, and we were part of the discussions as well. And we could understand, because it was a question of budget and resource allocation. So some countries would say, I'm not going to be able to protect the migrant workers' family. But then when you talk about local employees, there's really no argument to that. Why would you not be protecting or giving social security and provident fund? So if you're looking at a regional mechanism without a court, we are probably looking at maybe 10 years or 20 years from now, looking at maybe a consultative commission, an ASEAN consultative commission that receiving and sending countries can bring up issues like these, right? To talk about in terms of the different standards of different countries. And that may be the next step for the consensus if we are looking at something that's slightly more binding.
Thanks, Edmund. I think that should be another discussion, also retooling some of the bodies that we have in the ASEAN right now so that they can have that kind of mandate, which would be good for everyone in Southeast Asia. Simon and then Carlos.
Okay, thank you, Emily. First of all, I want to reply on the freedom of association during the crisis or during the pandemic. The interest thing I found in the website is I think last week or in the recent weeks, the World Health Organization just issued the statement that even during the pandemic, the right of the people to have the protest is very important. I mean, this is actually like every panelist mentioned before. I think the UN need to have a global standard for the government. Even during the pandemic, there's a essential rights or fundamental right that cannot be violated by the government. Because in Indonesia, the freedom of, like I said before, the freedom of association in Indonesia is really in a big threat, because now during the pandemic, the employer or the employer association use this pandemic situation to have a massive dismissal. For the example, in the case in Tangerang, there's 5,000 workers dismissed because the employer said because this is the impact of the coronavirus crisis. But actually, this factory actually produced the brand, the shoes brand, a very, very well-known brand. And as the information we gathered, the brand actually still commitment for the orders and etc. etc. But the employer still said that, oh, we have a problem with this coronavirus. We understand now. There's a problem with the maybe about the with the company cash flow and etc. etc. But my question is, how about or where did it go, the profits you collected for the years? Because for only like 3 or 4 months you already like whining about the situation and put the policy to dismiss the workers with the big numbers of the workers. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem we should address now. And for the migrant workers in Asia, I think we must push our government from the sending country or the receiving country to at least acknowledge these migrant workers as workers. Mm-hmm. Because like in Indonesia, we have a lot of case, especially for the woman. I agree with the Virginia. Woman is the most vulnerable in this working force. In our experience, the women who works in the domestic household usually not recognized as the workers. So at least all the countries in Asean acknowledge these workers as the workers and have the right to organize, or at least have access to the union to protect their right. Otherwise, we will have a lot of case every year because of the torture, even torture to the death.
Okay.
So I believe that my reply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Carlos, very quickly before we start our final remarks.
Yeah, thank you. And the question of collective bargaining, which is linked to other standards as well, to freedom of association in general. I think, yeah, the post-COVID scenario poses a number of challenges, of course, but I think I will look at it from the other side as well. It gives us lots of opportunities. You never forget that in times of crisis, there are also good opportunities for change. So, and this is our time. And I think I will join what others have said. We really, workers, the unions and other organizations that work with them should not wait for others to do the work for them. If you're going to wait, if we're going to wait until, the government or someone else takes measures on their own, I think that will never happen. I think time now is for action, for mobilization, for advocacy, etc. So that's why we are discussing tools that will give us, lead us in this direction. Now, this is the time to get organized, and this is the time to talk with our representatives. This is the time to carry out advocacy and lobby. This is the time to formulate proposals on how the recovery is going to be shaped in full compliance with international standards of freedom of association, collective bargaining. So this is the time, giving an opportunity. Now, in terms of migrants, if I may just 30 seconds, I think there might be, of course, difference between countries among, in terms of standards that are applicable. Not some countries have higher standards, better laws, and others weaker laws, etc. The issue here is following international standards. International standards are uniform. They apply to all countries, regardless of whether they have ratified specific conventions or not. I think we have already a number in relation to civil and political rights that clearly say the rights of freedom of association, for instance, and apply to all those who work or are under the jurisdiction of the state, whether they are the citizens or not. That's very important to know. Everybody who is under the jurisdiction of a given state. Yeah, that includes a number of other people, migrants, refugees, and many other people. So they need to be protected. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Carlos. And the last thing that you raised, especially now with the protests going on in the United States, I think it should be emphasized that race, national origin, or ethnicity shouldn't matter when it comes to upholding and protecting human rights. So there shouldn't, and Simon actually pointed it out, that migrant workers are workers, and they should not be treated any differently. They should also be afforded their right, especially the right to freedom of association. We don't have time. Before I turn over the floor again to the speakers for any final words that they have, I see that there are several requests for a copy of the draft guidelines. For those who would like to have a copy of the draft, and take note that this is just a draft, the working group, many of them, the speakers right now, many of them actually belong to the working group. We are still putting together and developing the guidelines. But if you would like to have a draft, please send an email to Ms. Boram Jang, my colleague. You can see her email in the public chat. So if you see for further questions and a copy of the draft guidelines, please contact Boram Jang. So you will see there. I'd like to close this session, but before that, I'd like to ask our speakers to have any final remarks or any closing words that you would like to say before we end this webinar? Attorney Suarez, would you like to go first?
Yeah. With pandemic, we will be facing retrenchment. We will be facing redundancy. Our work, our very work, which is the reason why there is a need for us to exercise our right to freedom of association, is at risk. But it is at this time where all the more that we should exercise our right of association, because our right to freedom of association does not only mean forming a union, because now we will be facing different kinds of work, different kinds or a mode of work will emerge, and therefore all the more that we should exercise our right to freedom of association, no matter how difficult it is. I mean, if we have all the reasons to of not forming an organization because of so much difficulty, then for as long as we have one reason to save our work, then all the more that we should exercise our right to freedom of association. Let us organize no matter what. It's not necessary that we form a union. Let us organize an association. Thank you, Emerlyn.
Thank you, Attorney Suarez. Simon, I'll call Simon, Edmund, Carlos, and then Clement.
Okay, thank you. For us in the Asean region and maybe globally, I think it's time to ask for the union and others civil organization to start and discuss very deeply about the uh, right of the workers, because otherwise we can always being trapped like the situation like this, like in Asia. We actually now we are trapped to like a race to the bottom, which is actually decrease the right of the workers in favor for the investment or for capitals. So the work or the discussion has to be start and have to conclude as the guidance for workers and union and civil society. I think that's my closing statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Edmund, you have the
Thank
floor.
you. Yeah, just very quickly, I think COVID has reminded us to look at the model of development around the world and how businesses treat the environment, treat climate, treat employees as well. So looking at, we need to look at the larger picture, because freedom of association is a right that's instrumental to something. And it's a passageway for people for employees to voice grievances, voice problems, voice challenges. And importantly, human rights needs to start reimagining the way we do things. Even ourselves, we face a lot of constraints, but now with COVID, we really need to think about new ways of doing old things. And income inequality is something that it's really important that we, and political movement in using human rights language. Sometimes when we say, oh, we are apolitical, that's not true. I think maybe we need to start becoming a bit more vocal on what political system we want. Maybe the neoliberalistic tendencies of how we have treated business operations, or how we look at development needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edmund. Carlos?
Thank you, Emerlyn. Very briefly to say thank you to all of you. A very enriching discussion. I join also you to emphasize this is a time that offers opportunities, offers the opportunity for action, to rethink and to rebuild things in a different way. And I think on all this, one key message is that we need to work all together. This is not a question only from the states, or for the governments, or for the businesses. It's also for us. No, social participation is the missing element, no, in the puzzle here. No, everybody talks about state investment, big states, and now everybody's talking about investment by private investors, etc. How is urgent is it, etc. But very few talk about the key element, which is social participation, you know, which could be really the key element in the success of the rebuilding of the economy in a new shape. So this is something for us to work, no? and to bring. We need to bring also or win that argument, no? That a new economy, a new society that's going to be built is it has to be built on this basis, otherwise it shouldn't be built in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Clement, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Merlin. I just want also to reiterate again my thanks to this important webinar, but also to ICG and then also Business Resource Center. As I mentioned in my presentation, I think the COVID also gives some momentum for this guideline also to review. And I want also to stress it because I think it's really important that in this guideline, we have also a dedicated paragraph on on the protection of the workers' rights in the time of crisis as such of this COVID-19, for example. And then also not just looking at principle, but also looking at also how companies should be dealing with such issues in the post-crisis, because it's also important. What we are seeing today is also that while COVID also showed this a big challenge in many companies, we also noticed that many companies were able also to survive thanks to the workers who continue to do their work, even sometimes in very challenging circumstances. And it's important also that post-COVID, they should be recognized. And then the company need to understand that their main asset, their main capital is the workers. It's not just because we saw from the COVID that practically even workers were able also to think how to reconvert the companies to deal with the current need of people of society, and we saw that, and I think we need also through this guideline, through also probably possibly training that we will be doing to give those kind of example of companies to understand the importance of protecting these fundamental rights, right to organize and then to associate of workers. I want also to say that it will be maybe before, and it will be important also that we have this guideline as soon as possible, because we know that the next coming years will be quite difficult in terms of association, in terms of assemblies rights, because we can already see how the recession, the inequality is increasing. And then we know that in a country where workers' rights are not protected, workers' rights to minimum leave, as Edmond says, is not protected, we know that it will increase the social disparity. It will also be a source of unrest. And it's important that we work together to try also to prevent what we are seeing coming up as very, very challenging, not just for the workers, but also for our democracy, for also the stability of our countries. So it's important also that we remind state that protecting this right, protecting the right of workers, ensuring that workers have the right to collective bargaining, they have the right to associate, to defend their interests, is also protecting the stability and the peace in society, is also fighting against poverty. So thank you for this important work that you are doing.
Thank you so much too, Clement. We don't have time anymore, and I'd like to apologize to those who submitted questions and we were unable to respond to them, but we'll try to respond to you through messages or through email if you send us your messages to the email that we put in the public chat. And I'd like to thank all the speakers that we have today for sharing your time and your expertise and your knowledge on this topic. And we're going to move forward, definitely, in developing these guidelines and putting out these guidelines in order to uphold and protect the freedom of association of workers in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe and have a good day.
Appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.